I'm Terry Kay of the Jewish Grandparents Network. Tonight, we are thrilled that child psychiatrist Dr. Kevin Kalikow will address how we can talk to our grandchildren about difficult subjects. We are absolutely thrilled that you joined us tonight. Thank you. All of you are on mute, and we ask that you please keep it that way unless you have a question. Then we do invite your questions. We will be taking questions throughout. You can put them in the chat bar, or you can raise your hand virtually on Zoom. I want to say a special thank you to our colleagues from Tiny Windows Consulting, Miriam Brousseau, she's the one with the colored hair, and Zoe Fleischer, who will help us facilitate tonight. And now may I introduce our wonderful board member, Bruce Jakubowicz. Bruce, his latest claim to fame is that he just had a new baby grandson, his second grandchild, and the bris is tomorrow morning. So he's got a house full of people. Mazel tov, Bruce, from all of us at JGN and our community. And over to you to introduce Kevin.
Thank you, Terry. I probably shouldn't admit it's kind of nice to be off on a quiet little spot in the house doing this rather than with all the chaos downstairs. But I probably won't let my wife hear that. In any event, Kevin Kalikow, MD, is a child psychiatrist in private practice for over 37 years. He also teaches at New York Presbyterian Hospital. Dr. Kalikow is the author of Your Child in the Balance, Solving the Psychiatric Medicine Dilemma, and also Kids on Meds, up-to-date information about the most commonly prescribed psychiatric medications. Dr. Kalikow is the father of 3 grown children and Saba to 5 granddaughters. He also, I should add, is just a great guy, and I'm proud to call him a friend for almost 30 years, ever since our sons played Little League Baseball together when they were young. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Bruce, and mazel tov again on the new baby. So you have to picture this. About 20 years ago, my daughter has finished college and she was living in DC, and we were down in Washington with my parents, and so we all kind of went over to see my daughter's apartment with her roommate. We walk in and there's a little table on the side. When you walk in, it's got all the liquor. And my father, in a very nonchalant way, goes over, starts examining the bottles, and says to my daughter, "So what are you drinking?" and starts going off about different types of scotch and discussing it. Now, I will tell you that I, as her father, never would have done that. I think it probably would have come across as either judgmental, why is he saying this, moralizing. So why do I start with that story? So let's go to that. Well, the reason I start is that we live in a world with many issues: drugs and alcohol, political polarization, an epidemic, war, evolving concepts of sexual identity, the overturning of Roe v. Wade. I mean, I could go on and on and on, as you know, and all of this being flamed by social media. So first, full disclosure, I can't solve any of those problems, and I'm not going to tell you how to solve those problems. Second disclosure, I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and we're really not talking about child and adolescent psychiatry. What we're talking about is how to talk to kids, and that's something that I do every day, and so something I can teach you how to do also. So if we can have that next slide. So, no, go back. Yep. So the reason right? The reason they can play that good is their parent. So there's the slide. There you go. The reason they can play that good is their parents aren't yelling at them from the sidelines. So why did I start with that story about my father and my daughter? As grandparents, we have a different relationship. And that's a word that I'm telling you right now, you're going to be hearing over and over the next 40 minutes. It's loving and it's caring, but we can broach topics that parents aren't going to broach, or at least we can do it without an agenda. We're not kind of worried about a lot of the practical issues like bedtime and homework and getting to school. We can just kind of have that discussion, kind of the way my father had this discussion about scotch. So also, most kids are more mature with their grandparents than they are with their parents. The truth is, we all regress at home. I will be the first to admit, I certainly do. I'm not the mature person I am in the office doesn't always come home at night. And so as grandparents, we have a unique opportunity to talk in a safe and caring relationship. So our goal tonight is going to be how to talk to your grandchild about really almost anything. So first, a word about PowerPoint. The truth is, I know almost nothing about PowerPoint beyond the basics. And the truth is, we're not using PowerPoint. We're using Keynote, and that's what they gave me on the computer. I didn't really know the difference between PowerPoint and Keynote. I was upset when I got it. I couldn't translate one from the other. So I was kind of intimidated. And when it came to making this PowerPoint, I was a little anxious. And so who did I go to? Well, I went to my 12-year-old granddaughter, and she walked me through. So here's a little bit of a spoiler alert. Talking to kids is ultimately not about us talking to them. It's about a relationship. Again, that word. And that means it's a two-way street. Okay, so overview for the next half hour. We're first going to talk about just the number of variables there are in this discussion. It's a big, complex discussion because there's so much that you can talk about. Number two, then we're going to change into the 14, let's call them the do's and don'ts about talking to your grandchild. So first, let's go to 8 variables that we just have to consider because it's just the reality. So number 1, what's the nature of your relationship with your grandchild? How often do you see a grandchild? I know grandparents who see their grandchild every day. They live around the corner. They're really a part of their lives. I know other grandparents who live across the country see their grandchild once a year. Very different. And what's your style? Are you the more hands-on and kind of very comfortable talking to kids? Or are you a little bit more distant? Maybe you're just not quite so comfortable, with kids. Maybe you're comfortable with infants, maybe, but not adolescents. Maybe with adolescents, but not with infants. So in short, how familiar are you with your grandchild, and how comfortable are you with them, and how comfortable are they with you? Okay, number 2, who's asking you to speak? Are the parents asking you? If so, how come? Is the grandchild asking you? Maybe they just want to see what grandma thinks about a certain topic. Maybe you're doing it just for fun, just kind of building the relationship. Maybe you're going rogue and you're worried that the grandchild knows about the important issues of the day, or maybe you're even worried that your kind of crazy daughter, who's going to kind of politically out on the wing, is not going to give them the right material. And I say that on either wing. Okay, so the point is that you kind of have to know who's asking you to speak. Next, the age of the child. There are 6-year-olds, there are 12-year-olds, there are 18-year-olds. Development is a continuum, and there's certainly everything between those 3 ages. So each age is different. Obviously, 6-year-olds are not 18-year-olds. They're very, very different. They're different in their how they think, how they feel, their priorities, their patience, all of those things. You're probably not going to be talking to your 4-year-old grandchild about the Ukraine, okay? Early adolescence, maybe, but you have to be aware that early adolescents can sometimes really very much identify with their parent. And so you kind of have to be careful and consider that, because they might feel a little bit between. Adolescents really value their independence, and they want to see themselves as individualized thinkers. And so they may push back more. On the other hand, they can also tolerate a little bit more challenge to what they're thinking, as long as you do it in a reasonable way, which we'll talk about later. Next, number 4, the personality and the skill set of the child. There are children who are quiet and thoughtful. There are children who are rambunctious and fidgety and impatient and who can't grab their attention. There are children who are defiant and oppositional and are simply going to disagree with anything that you say. There are children who are overly sensitive and anxious and withdraw because of that. And then there are children who are overly sensitive and anxious and they might get silly because of that. All this has to do with the personality of the child and their skill set. There are some kids who are very articulate and use language well, and there are some kids who don't do so well with language. Next, psychiatric disorders. This is not a discussion about psychiatric disorders, but I'm a child psychiatrist and I have to make a public health announcement, which is that psychiatric disorders are real. Okay, they're not made up, and they affect, let's call it roughly 20% of children. These include children with depression, anxiety disorders, ADHD, autism spectrum disorders. Now, by definition, disorders affect functioning. So when we talk, for example, about anxiety, it's not correct to say about a child, say, with an anxiety disorder, well, we all have some anxiety. That's not right. I mean, we all might have some anxiety, but the child with an anxiety disorder, the anxiety is much stronger and affects how they think and how they see the world. And so you have to kind of know that and guide yourself accordingly. A lot of times kids, for example, with anxiety will get caught up in a cognitive distortion. In short, not a long lecture here, but in short, what a cognitive distortion is the ways in which the feeling side of the brain affects the thinking side of the brain, the more objective side of the brain. So quick example, child's walking down the hall and their friend passes them in the hall and all the hubbub between classes, and their friend didn't say hi. And the child thinks, oh, my friend hates my guts. Well, that's the feeling brain taking over the more objective part of the brain. And the child has to learn how to deal with that. Okay, next. What's your style? Okay, are you kind of calm and collected? Are you volatile and dramatic and get angry easily? Are you easily made anxious? Are you flexible or are you insistent? All of these things are going to affect your presentation to your grandchild. Also, how close is the topic to your heart? Okay, are you the president of the local Planned Parenthood? Or are you somebody who clings religiously to the belief that conception begins at birth? Again, those things are going to affect, your discussion with your grandchild. Are you an environmental engineer at the EPA? Or are you the CEO of Exxon? Again, those things are going to are a variable that affects your discussion. Okay, next. What's the issue to be discussed? Okay. Are they global issues that you care about? Okay. Are carbon emissions going to destroy the environment? Is Russia going to leave the Ukraine? Is Trump going to run in 2 years? I mean, those are things that you might care about. Or are they the more personal issues that the grandchild probably cares about more? Am I wearing the right sneakers to school? Who am I going to sit with at lunch? Are my parents going to break up? Is my friend suicidal? Okay. Am I gay? Am I bi? Am I going to get an A in AP biology? And if I don't get an A in AP biology, am I going to get into Cornell? Who's doing what on Facebook? Is a shooter going to come to my school? These are the places where kids live. And so because there are so many topics, we're not going to talk about a particular topic, but we're going to talk about the general rules for guiding those discussions. Last, what's your goal? Some possible goals, and not the only goals, but is this simply, again, a way to relate to your grandchild? Simply kind of a way to develop rapport and something kind of to do? And I think I say that, in a great way. Is this a good way to relate stories about your own childhood? Are you trying to convince them of your point of view? Like that's the goal. Are you trying to teach them how to think about these various issues at hand? Or are you trying to help them manage their anxiety and their worries and their concerns? The truth is that kids usually talk to their parents, not their grandparents, about a lot of these issues. But regardless of what your goals are, you're always building a relationship with your grandchild so that the grandchild feels safe talking to you. Whatever you talk about, the first thing you have to do is to build a relationship in order to talk about anything. So we're going to now switch over to talk about let's call it 14 do's and don'ts of grandparents. But just before we do, a secret, okay? Talking to grandchildren, as we can see, it's about more than talking. But I think we might have a couple of quick questions here.
Yes, I would. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you so much for those introductory statements. I'd love to open this up to our group to please add your questions in chat or raise your hand and we'll call on you, or unmute yourself and just ask your question. I do have a preliminary question from a participant. Is there an ideal environment? Anything that we should keep in mind about where these conversations take place?
Okay, great question. I would just ask that questioner, hold on for about 5 or 10 minutes, and I think we're going to cover that.
Cool. Anybody else want to jump in? Feel free to unmute yourself.
I have a question that I would like to ask. Thank you very much for having this symposium. I think it's wonderful. My situation is the following. I have a granddaughter who will be 18 years old and in her final year of high school. She is presently in a residential facility, school in Utah, severe anxiety and depression. I am not really that clear. Let me just tell you my goal. My goal is just keeping connected, making sure that she knows that I'm here, that I'm thinking of her. Whether she chooses to open up to me or not is another story. She does not.
Oh, Barbara, can you unmute yourself again, please?
That she is going to be writing to me. So my question for me is, I write to her every week. I'm sorry. I write to her every week. I send her cards. My goal is really just to let her know that she's on my mind. I'm thinking of her, and I hope that she's doing okay. But if I'm writing to her every week, the notes and the cards that I write to her, I don't want her to look at it and say, oh my God, here's another, ridiculous. So I try to put in a few things that's happening in my life that might be of interest to her. Do you have any response or reaction to this situation for me?
Sure. First of all, I mean, these are really tough situations, for grandparents, for parents, and for the kids. They're really tough. And I give you a lot of credit for just trying to stay in touch with her. And I think that almost whatever you do, you're doing it right just by keeping in touch. You can argue both ways. If it's regular, then you might feel like she's thinking, oh, here comes another one. But I think on the other hand, I think that she probably comes to rely on the regularity of your letters and probably counts on them. And not every letter is going to be a masterpiece. I think it's really more, again, about staying connected to what you're doing, which is about building a relationship, which is what really, as you see, is the kind of the foundation of this discussion. So I think that you're doing it just right.
Thank you, Kevin. May I ask you that you proceed with your presentation?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So I guess let's go back to the PowerPoint. And we're going to now go through 14 do's and don'ts. Woo! This is fancier than I thought. So we need the next slide. There you go. Okay. So point number 1 here. Accept that you cannot control their world. Okay. You cannot simply get them to believe what you believe. There are a lot of forces in their life. Society is a powerful force in getting anybody, particularly children, to think what they think. And you have to accept that you only have so much control. You're not going to fight TV and Facebook and TikTok and their friends and YouTube and et cetera, et cetera. You can challenge those things. And I think that you probably should challenge those things, but you can't think that they're going to live in the bubble that you would like and simply believe what you believe, and because you're the only person giving them some input. You're not. Now, having said that, again, you can challenge it. You can show them what you believe. Just a kind of a small example of that is a bunch of years ago, I began to teach one of my granddaughters Kiddush for Friday night. It didn't seem like a big deal, but I think that what I was giving her is the message of what I value. So I value Jewish tradition and the ability to do things like that. And so it's again, I'm not putting my Friday night Kiddush up against TikTok, but it's my way of influencing her in terms of what I value. You can also ask them to take you online, because that's where a lot of kids are these days, and ask them, kind of go into their world and say, well, what do they think about X that they're seeing online? So the point is that you cannot control the world in which they live. Okay, next. You want to build a trusting and safe relationship. That I hope I've made abundantly clear. But you want to do it however you do it, okay? Relationships really set the groundwork to discuss any of these difficult topics, okay? Now, how do you build a relationship? It's basically, there are two important elements: time and trust. So, one, spend time, okay? Kids oftentimes will ask for gifts, but what they value really is time, with a valued adult. So spend the time. Use the gifts that you buy together. Do whatever it is that you do, whether it be, have a baseball catch, play checkers, play cards, watch a TV show together, discuss a book, really whatever it is, that they're going to find comfortable, but it's spending time together. The other element of building a relationship is trust. So, and trust is based on honesty. So I'm going to give you a true story. Over this past summer, another granddaughter, my 4-year-old granddaughter, was in from out of town, and she was drawing picture after picture after picture after picture. And after a few days, I saw the pile of pictures, on the 4-year-old pictures on the table. And I said, so I said to myself, we really have to kind of clean up. And I guess my kind of cleanliness nature, my obsessive nature to clean up, got the better of me. And I took a pile of these drawings and I put them in recycling. And as I was doing it, I said, if I was smart, I'd kind of bury these at the bottom of recycling. But somehow or another, I was just plain dumb. And I didn't do that. And so the pictures were sitting on the top of the recycling, but I figured she wouldn't see it. Of course, 2 days later, I'm walking with her in the garage. She looks in the recycling bin. She says, "Who threw out my pictures?" So I said to her, well, I put them there. I said, but we didn't really throw them out. We're putting them in recycling so that we can make fresh paper for fresh pictures. Well, make a long story short, she was not buying it. Who threw out my pictures? She wanted to know. So I said, I was honest and I took responsibility for it. And I said, I put them there. I said, it was a mistake and I'm sorry I did it. I didn't realize how important this was, but let's get them out. And I took them all out and we found a place for them. And I'm hoping through that, again, story with a 4-year-old, that I'm at least beginning to build trust. So what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is bury the recycling. You're like, don't get caught. However, if you do get caught, be honest, take responsibility, apologize, and just build the trust. You're entitled to make mistakes. We all make mistakes. Just you want to own them. So again, the point here is build a relationship that is both trusting and safe and feels safe to the child. Okay, next. And this kind of gets a little bit to the question that we were talking about, that the person asked a few minutes ago. Choose the setting, the right setting for your discussion. My suggestion in general is do it privately. One-to-ones create intimacy. Once somebody else invades a one-to-one, you have to, number one, it changes the entire dynamic depending on who that person is. And you begin to lose the principal child's attention. And then you have a problem. So what's the right setting? Well, if it's a one-to-one, any place that's quiet that you can do a one-to-one. You can go for a walk. You can go for a drive. You can go out for a meal, for lunch. I used to go with my granddaughter to Starbucks, and we'd each get a steamed milk, and we'd sit there. And she was little, but we would kind of have a discussion. It was one-to-one time. Now, the truth is that you don't always get that choice. Okay, some conversations are just at the Thanksgiving Day table, and there I think that the lesson is when you're in that kind of a big group is follow the rules of civility. So I remember as a kid, Thanksgiving Day in the late 60s, and my cousins would be arguing with my grandfather about one of the political issues of the day, and it got kind of heated sometimes. But what I remember most of all was that the discussion always ended in laughter. It never was polarized. There were different opinions, but it always ended up with everybody laughing. So that if it's a family discussion, you want to obviously have it in the family and follow the rules of civility. But if it's really between you and your grandchild, you want to keep it one-to-one and build some intimacy. In addition, you want to consider who sets the agenda. Okay. Are we talking about your concerns or the child's concerns? Remember that most kids are not as concerned about the world issues as that you want to discuss. They're more concerned about bullies and grades and college and things, social life, things like that. So sometimes it might even be nice to let them set the agenda. Now, that might take a little bit of coaxing. How do you do that? Well, you ask some leading questions, about school, about friends, not yes, no questions. Are you taking math? Of course I'm taking math. But you might say, what are you doing in math? Or what are you learning about in social studies? So the point is that you want to choose the right setting for your discussion, but you also want to follow their agenda a little bit. Next.
Kevin, before
Yes,
you go in, we have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Alison has a hand raised, and we also have an earlier question about talking about religion that we can ask you now, or we can ask you a little bit later. But Alison, would you like to go ahead with your question? We welcome it.
I have 3 grandchildren now. The oldest is 4. And when my daughter was in preschool, she would bring home all this artwork, and we would tape it or push pin it on a wall in the basement. And when it got full, I would take a picture of her in front of it and then recycle them. And what you might consider is having your grandchild hold their favorite. So you take a picture of them holding their favorite, keep the favorite, and recycle the others. Or she could take it home and let it be her mom's problem. But you save the favorite one and take a picture of her with them.
So I think that's a brilliant idea. I think that the idea of me saying to my son and daughter-in-law, here's a pile of drawings that you're going to take back to San Francisco, I think I would have been pretty quickly. But I think that your idea is a great idea. Taking pictures, especially today, where taking pictures is so easy. I will tell you that years ago, when I was, first in practice, I used to have a Polaroid camera, and that's what I used to do. If one of the kids did a picture that they liked, we would take a quick Polaroid of it. But today, it's so much easier, and I think your idea is a great one. Absolutely.
Or even better, have your son take a picture of you and your wife with the child and her holding the artwork in front of the wall with all the artwork.
Absolutely. So you think that by trying to convince her, take a picture of it and show her, and now we're going to get rid of all this artwork so that we can go into cycling. I'm kidding.
She probably won't remember the next time she comes to visit you.
I hope you're right. We'll find out. I'll have to let you know that for sure.
Kevin, just before you move on, would you like to address before, a little bit later, after you're further along, how to address the issue of religion with our grandchildren, especially if the parents are not interested and are not practicing, and yet it might be important to us?
You know what? I think if we can, let's hold that, because
Sure.
I'd like to get back to some of the rules, and I think couching it in the rules would be a good idea. Okay, so now the next point, listen. Okay, I know that this does not come naturally to all people of our religious persuasion. I always think about Annie Hall and the split screen with the Jewish family over here, and you remember what it was like. It was not quite a conversation. And what you have to remember in talking to your grandchild is that this is supposed to be a conversation. Okay, it's back and forth and back and forth. It's not a political harangue. So some rules. Don't interrupt. Interrupting just shuts kids down. Remember that kids can be kind of unsure of themselves and can be easily intimidated. They oftentimes, again, depending on the age of the child, they might assume adults are right, but they also know when something sounds fishy and when it doesn't sit well with them. Excuse me. Don't talk too much. That kind of crowds them out. Don't interrupt yourself. The biggest interrupter that we have of ourselves is our cell phone. Okay, now that might not be so much for people grandparents' age, but I think sometimes it is. It's not just our children and grandchildren who can get stuck on the cell phone. Remember that talking to your grandchild is really sacred time, and I don't mean that as hyperbole. This is really, at least as far as I'm concerned, this is what life is about. These are my religious experiences, really talking to my grandchildren. Now, sometimes you just have to be quiet, which is not easy. Sometimes you might have to prompt them with some questions and ask them what they think. If you're going to ask questions, which I think is a great idea, you want to ask more open-ended questions again. Things like, what do you think? Questions, as opposed to yes and no questions. But sometimes they might not have an answer. And if they don't have an answer, don't push. You can encourage, but you don't want to push them too hard. Again, the point is, in a word, listen. Now, next, however, this is kind of a takeoff on this point, but the next point is listen without judgment. Okay, sounding judgmental never works. Think about your tone as much as your content. They may or may not agree with you, but assume they're doing their best to try to arrive at an opinion. And if you come across as thinking that, or saying even more so, that they're being, ridiculous, or that's stupid, or you come across as demeaning or ridiculing, that is clearly going to shut things down in a hurry. Sarcasm, you have to be very careful with sarcasm. Sarcasm is a fine art. It can be either really done well, in which case there's kind of you're sarcastic, but there's a knowing smile that goes with it, and they know where you're coming from, or it can go over the line and sound aggressive. Kids are very sensitive about feeling disrespected, and what the child should feel unconditional love, regardless of what they say or what their comments are. They should feel respected, even if they're not agreed with. So again, feeling judged is a surefire way to shut people down. Now, idealistic adolescents can be extremely frustrating, as we all know. They can be provocative, but also sensitive. And so sometimes, you have to kind of tread lightly here and almost ask permission. And I use that a little bit in quotes, but almost ask permission, to say something. So, for example, and you have to say this kind of calmly and without judgment, you might say something like, look, I understand your point, but let me tell you how I disagree with you, or I'm going to agree with you, but I also have to disagree with you. Like, these are things that show some balance and are confrontative without being judgmental. I'm not sure I agree with it, your assessment. I understand it. I'm not sure I agree with it, but we'll see. You don't have to agree, but you do have to respect. So you also want to model respect for other people too. I mean, as we all know, this is a polarized world these days. It's very easy to roll your eyes or just make some kind of outright demeaning comment about the quote unquote other side, whichever way it goes. I would suggest that, number one, you want to try to model for your grandchild that you're trying to understand where other people are coming from without judgment. In that light, I would just make a quick parenthetical recommendation. Jonathan Haidt, it's Haidt, wrote a book called The Righteous Mind, in which he's a psychologist down at NYU, and he wrote a very interesting book just about how people on the right and how the left think. So the point being to try to understand as opposed to being judgmental. Bottom line, judgmental never works. Did somebody say something?
It's Terry.
I can't see anybody anymore.
When you're ready, there are a couple of questions about what you've been discussing.
Okay, let's stop and take a couple of questions.
Thank you. Well, one of the participants has asked me to read the question, which I will do. Other than concern for the safety of your grandchild or others, are there any situations where a grandparent should tell the parents information told to them in confidence by their grandchildren?
That is a very tricky question. And read the very first sentence again about safety. I can't hear you.
Other than concern for the safety of your grandchild or others, are there?
Okay. So let's put safety aside, which I think that makes the discussion, I think, a little bit easier. If you were going to say, I'm trying to think of what you would want to say or have to say. I think that anytime you do that without the child's knowledge beforehand or with their permission, I think that you are it can easily feel like you're going behind their back. And I'm not sure why you would want to do that. If they're going to say yes anyway, then ask their permission. You have nothing to lose. If they're going to say no, and it's not an issue of safety, then I wouldn't do it. I would respect that it's not a confidential. It's not a confidential relationship, but it's a confidentiality of sorts. It's a respect. It's a respect for the one. What, I can't hear. It's a respect.
I wanted to give this. I asked that question. And I just wanted to explain the situation I'm thinking of. A grandchild told you something in confidence that they're doing something the parents don't want them to do. It's not a safety issue, but they definitely are not doing. They're doing things the parents would not want them to do. If you tell the parents, you really damage the relationship with the grandchild. If you don't tell the parents and they find out you knew this and didn't say anything, that hurts that relationship.
Yeah, well, I think that parents in that. Again, I have to go back to the very beginning of the talk. There are so many variables: the age of the child, what they're doing, level of safety. Of course, all of those things are important. But I think that in that particular situation, again, depending on what it is, I think it's incumbent on the parents to try to understand where you are coming from. And in fact, depending on many variables, if you see the relationship going in that direction, you might actually want to have a discussion with the parents almost preemptively saying, listen, I'm getting close to Joey and things come up. I'm not going to necessarily tell you everything. And I just want you to know that from the get-go. But of course, if I think there's any issue encroaching on safety, then of course I'm going to tell you. And I think that most parents would understand that, and actually, in some ways, maybe welcome it that their child has such a relationship with their grandparent.
Thank you, Kevin. We've had a couple of requests, people saying, "Wait, we want to hear what else Dr. Kalikow has to say." So, if you could, we've got we'd like to leave a good 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So, if you'd like to proceed with your slides, thank you.
Okay, so here's the deal. I'm going to pick up the speed a little bit, but if we can, no questions until the end. Otherwise, I won't get there. So next, affirm their emotions. Okay. Kids are scared, they're hurt, they're angry. Their emotions are their experiences. They're not their arguments. Now, you can disagree with an argument, but you can't disagree with an emotion. You can't disagree with the child saying, I feel. Some things simply hurt. War, bullies, violence, that causes pain. Scary things, random violence, kids who are confused, about, let's say, sexual orientation. You can't disagree with their emotions. Now, there are difficult, when you're talking about difficult topics, and we are, you can't avoid the pain. And so therefore, you shouldn't minimize the child's pain. You should never say, oh, it's nothing. It isn't nothing. It is something, at least to the child, and with good reason. There's pain in the world and we can't make it disappear. And they have real emotional reactions. And we can't make those reactions disappear. So kids in general will manage their difficulties better when their emotions are affirmed, not when they're denied. So again, the bottom line here is accept the child's emotions that come with the world's problems, just as we have our emotions. Next, monitor your own emotions. Okay, you're entitled to your honest emotions. Show your passion. Okay, it conveys both the importance of the topic to you and you're being honest. That said, you want to keep your emotions in check. You want to stay calm and in control. Passion doesn't mean losing control. Now that said, you're human, you might lose control, but get it back. Okay, all of those things, your anger, your anxiety, can be contagious, and sometimes they can be scary to kids. And so, the kids will be less able to manage those emotions than you are. So again, bottom line, monitor your own emotions. Next, know your child. Kids, like adults, are all different. Some have patience, some don't. Some care about these topics, some don't. Some understand higher concepts, some don't. When I was in college, I was taking a course in child psychology. We learned about Piaget and his cognitive stages. And I came home and I had one of my little cousins over and I did an experiment. I took 10 pennies, I lined them up, I asked her to count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then I took another 10 pennies and I spread them out a little wider with greater spaces between the pennies. I had her count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10. I said, which row has more pennies? She said, the second row. I said, what? And I went through it again. I said, look, there are 10 here. I tried to explain it. I was, 18 years old. And I was incredulous that she just could not get the fact that 10 pennies equals 10 pennies, no matter how they're spaced. Well, come to find out, she was in a particular stage of cognitive development. And I could have sat there until I was green in the face. It wasn't happening for her. And so, what do you do about that? Well, you understand that it exists, but number two, you have to keep a sense of humor about development. You can't help this. They can't help the stage they're in, and you're not going to take your 70-year-old, lessons and wisdom and kind of shove it down their throat. Keeping that kind of inward smile helps me get through the day talking to kids. I will tell you, as you can imagine, I hear some very ridiculous arguments from middle schoolers. At this point, I just smile. And I just know that in a few years, they're going to outgrow that argument. Okay, it's not going to be anything I say that helps them outgrow it. In fact, if anything, the more I say, it's just going to kind of slow down the process. Now, some adolescents understand those higher levels just as you do. And you can talk, for example, about cost benefit analysis about why this particular company is doing or not doing some environmental intervention. You can talk about philosophical issues like, where does life begin, if you're going to have a discussion about the abortion issue. In fact, some of the adolescents thrive on those kind of moral issues, and it can actually be a fun discussion. Not that abortion is fun, but whatever the topic is, you can kind of really get into it, that part is a lot of fun. So the point: know the developmental level of the person you're talking to. Next, really important: tell your stories. Tell personal anecdotes. Kids relate to stories. The human brain is wired to listen to stories. Well, again, when I was in college, about a year later after that first story, I was asked, it must have been around the Yom Kippur War, I suspect, but I was asked to be on a panel and talking to some kids in a Hebrew school. And I was about Israel's needs. And I went in, I had just read an article in a journal about the geopolitical significance of the various forces in the Middle East. And I remember sitting there, and I'm talking to these Hebrew school kids who were probably in 7th grade. And I'm trying to explain to them these geopolitical influences. And, I struggled for about a minute, and I realized I am going no place fast. I'm just like spinning my tires in the snow. There was an Israeli soldier who was an Israeli who had been a soldier, also on the panel with me. And I'll never forget, he turned to me, he kind of put his hand on my shoulder. He said, give me a minute. And so I happily gave him the floor. And he says, I grew up in Israel, and I flew a jet plane during the war. And here's what it's like to fly a jet plane. And this is why we need jet planes. And the kids were mesmerized. And I learned a great lesson from this guy about, telling stories instead of simply being, kind of overly intellectual and philosophical and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so remember that when you tell your stories, you're making a point and you're building a relationship. Stories are powerful and they're remembered. Okay, they convey your beliefs. And I think in some ways more important, they are passed on to the next generation. Bottom line, tell your stories. Next.
Yeah, Kevin?
Yeah.
We are just about out of time. We have many questions that we'd like to get to. So may I respectfully ask if there's one more point you would like to make?
You know what? If you give me 1 minute, I'll do all the points.
Sounds good.
Okay. So next, be prepared for it's a different world now than it was then. I mean, the truth is, in some ways it's not. Teenagers still have romance, and teenagers still want to argue and want independence. But in many ways, the world has changed, and you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. And so accept that their world is in fact different. Next, be careful about contradicting their parents. Not all grandparents and parents are on the same page. And what you don't want to do is divide the family further. That doesn't mean that you can't disagree, but if you're going to do so, you're going to do so with transparency in front of the parents in a respectful way. And hopefully the parents can do it the same way so that it comes across as a disagreement, not a polarizing argument. Next, as I said earlier, appreciate and stay alert for anxiety and depressive disorders. There are some discussions that really need to be left to the professional with kids who have significant difficulties in this regard. Next, do something to solve the problem, okay? You can learn about the topic with your grandchild. You can donate money with your grandchild. You can go out and clean the town with your grandchild. It doesn't really matter what you're doing. It's about building the relationship. So do something. Don't just discuss it, but do something to solve the problem. And last, appreciate your grandchild's abilities and their insights. What they can teach you. And so with that, I want to, number one, thank my granddaughter who helped allay my own anxiety with the PowerPoint. She taught me to do some really cool stuff, as you saw in the beginning with the PowerPoint, with those whirling sentences. And by getting her help, I'm hopefully building her self-esteem and building, again, that kind of safe, open, respectful, non-judgmental relationship. And that'll be the last time you hear the word relationship. So that when the time comes for her to ask, for me to ask her which scotch she's drinking, she'll be ready to tell me. And so now, go to the last slide. We kind of did it a little early, but watch this. What do you think of that? Okay, so thanks for listening. I greatly appreciate your attention. I'll take questions.
That's very good. Very cool. Thank you for your tremendous depth of knowledge. We've had a couple of requests. People, our participants wanted to know if you would be willing to share the slides with them.
Sure.
Great, then we will send it out. And now there are a couple of questions, and I invite you to unmute yourselves. How about if we start with Carla?
Hi. I really appreciate all. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I appreciate all the stages and stops along the way that you shared. I missed the very beginning, and so I asked Terry, did I miss the part where you find out how you get time with your 3 and 5.5-year-old out of town grandchildren, and you finally get put in front of this, and I did, Bubby says, put your hands on your head. I mean, I didn't know what to do. And they're impossible to engage. I can't have some philosophical discussion. And so from this group, if those of you who have I just want to engage. I don't want to teach a lot. How do I do that? The parents are not helping. Okay,
so obviously these days there are a lot of out-of-town relationships. That's just the age we live in. I don't know if that's the bad news, but let's make that the bad news. The good news is that we do have technology that we can use, and we can use that to our advantage with different ages. I will tell you that what we do, what really my wife does, with our 4-year-old out-of-town granddaughter, is she has and maybe Adrian, you can put this in a chat. It's the little machine, okay? And the little machine comes up with stories. We can call our granddaughter over the machine. We each screen, like a FaceTime. But there are digital books that come on, and my wife regularly reads these books, and my granddaughter simply cannot get enough of it.
Wow.
So that's one hard suggestion.
Thank you. Thank you a lot.
Let's go to Jana. Am I pronouncing your name correctly? You can unmute if you would, please.
Okay, now can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for the very interesting presentation, Dr. Kalikow. I have a 5-year-old granddaughter.
Dad's having a massage at 11:30 for his.
You gotta love it. Sorry, Jana.
Yeah, go ahead.
Somebody was unmuted in a rather personal moment.
All right. So I can continue, right?
Please do. Sorry about that.
So, Dr. Kalikow, I have a 5-year-old granddaughter, and her mother is a single mother, and she's dating a man. So my granddaughter is telling me that she didn't want her mother to marry this man. And my question would be, should I tell her mother that her daughter doesn't want her to marry this man?
I mean, the short answer to that question, again, given all the variables, with a 5-year-old, I think that I'm not sure that she's really saying something to you in confidence. I mean, maybe she is. It's a little hard to know. But you can certainly I think that you can certainly broach the topic with your daughter and ask her kind of what she, from her point of view, what does she think your granddaughter is thinking? And it might just kind of come out that
No, she's very clear. The granddaughter is very clear. She's saying it like as if she's a grown-up person. She's saying if she marries a man, then she will have less time to play with me.
Right, but I guess my point is her mother aware of what she, the granddaughter, is thinking and feeling? My guess is she might already be, and in which case it's a difficult situation, but you're not in a bind in that case. But so I think that broaching the topic with your daughter would be a reasonable thing. I mean, if your daughter comes to you, I think a more difficult question would be if your daughter comes to you and says, boy, my daughter just loves, this guy I'm going to marry. Okay.
She does like the man, but
and she says, I love him and I can't wait for my mother to get married to him. Okay. If she says that, then now you have two conflicting opinions, she's talking out of both sides of her mouth. And you might want to try, as the adult, you might want to try to understand that. But in general, I think that broaching the topic with her mother without necessarily saying, you know what she told me? She said this. I think that, again, whatever the age of the child is, you want to do it in a kind of respectful, responsible way. You never want to come across as kind of you're the one who's spilling the beans. That I think is disrespectful to the relationship with your grandchild. You can convey that information, but without that kind of tenor of of kind of breaking a secret.
So if I concluded correctly, then it's always better to say to the mother what the granddaughter is saying in confidence to me.
No, I'm not saying quite that. I'm saying that I think that you should, the first step I think would be broaching the topic with her mother.
What does it mean, broaching? Discussing?
Bringing it up.
Say it again?
Okay.
Bringing it up.
Yeah, you can bring up the discussion and tell her that, and just see what her understanding of what her daughter feels about a marriage would be, which will give you a better sense.
Okay, thank you.
Terry, you got
Jana, thank you so much for the question. We have two minutes left in our scheduled time. There is a final question. Several people have asked about address the issue of religion, and we know that this is a subject that is quite close to many of the hearts of our grandparents. We see it in our Facebook group all the time. And I'd love you to spend a minute or two on that before we go. When we hit 8 o'clock, some of you may turn into pumpkins, and we understand if you have to leave. And if you do go, we want to say thank you so much for joining us, and we will let you know about our next presentation, which will be close to Thanksgiving, and it'll be to do with experiencing gratitude and how that can help us in our relationships. So again, thank you so much for coming, but don't go yet if you can stay. So Dr. Kalikow, could you address that? How to tackle the issue of religion and religious practice if we feel something and there's something we want to do religion-wise, but the parents are not in agreement?
Okay. So, I mean, I suspect that, and particularly given the number of people who have asked that question, that this is not an unusual event. I think that there are different levels of engagement, and ultimately, I think the answer is going to be relationship. Not only your relationship with your grandchild, which we've talked about, but also your relationship with your child, the parent of your grandchild, and so that they have an understanding of what your point of view is and where you're coming from and what your goal is. It also depends on how big a disagreement there is. There are ultimately, whatever you do, you want to be true to yourself. Okay, you don't want to do something that is not natural to you. There are some things in life I just would not do. Let's say in terms of a religious partaking of some kind of religious ritual, I just wouldn't do it. And I want to be true to myself. At the same time, you want to be respectful of others, in particular the parents' views of what they want for their child. I think that if you present yourself honestly and you're obviously understanding of where the parents are coming from, but that this is what you do, let's say in your home, then I think when it's done respectfully and in a good relationship, there's not an issue. Just by way of example, when our grandchildren come to our house, Friday night does not necessarily look like it does at their house. Okay. But it's all done, everybody kind of knows in a sense what they're getting into when they come to our house. My wife and I are being true to what we believe and what we do. And at the same time, we're being respectful of kind of not taking it into kind of down roads that would make anybody else in the family disrespected, or that they would make them extremely uncomfortable. But they're tough topics. But ultimately, the answer is very simple: build relationship.
Thank you. On that note, we're going to end with our deep, deep gratitude to Dr. Kevin Kalikow. And we will send out by Thursday the recording, so you can share it with your friends, and we'll tell you where it's posted. We'll also send you the slides and a few other goodies in a follow-up email. So I cannot see Dr. Kalikow anymore. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
I'm assuming so. Zoe, work your magic so I can look him in the eye. Hello again to all our friends who joined us tonight, and some very important friends, personal, and my sister-in-law, and a whole bunch of important people are with us tonight. And to all our JGN supporters, we value our relationship with you so much, and we so appreciate your being here tonight. Dr. Kalikow, 1,000 thanks. And we look forward, thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
very
so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, all.
Lila Tov.
Thanks.
Lila Tov.